Typically in the realm of entertainment, when something is well received, not too far behind it is a sequel or spin-off, or some other way to cash in on it. Striking while the iron is hot has been a practice in video games for many years, with franchises like Mario, Mega Man, Castlevania, and even in RPGs like Final Fantasy. However, it wasn't always common to have direct sequels like you see with franchises such as Resident Evil or the myriad of others in the present-day gaming ecosystem. Now, before we dive right into the meat and potatoes of Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, I need to set the stage. The last game we reviewed was Final Fantasy IV, which launched in 1991, a lifetime ago by video game standards. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years was released in Japan in February of 2008, just under 17 years after Final Fantasy IV. Roughly the same amount of time as between the original Nintendo and the GameCube. During that same time span, 47 other pieces of Final Fantasy related media, including games, movies, and re-releases, would be released. By 2008, Squaresoft had merged with Enix due to financial issues in 2003, which we will discuss in a future video. Now, they employed a myriad of people that were veterans in the industry, making games like the Dragon Quest, Star Ocean, Grandia, and of course, Final Fantasy franchises. However, although Square Enix had all of the resources to make a successful follow-up to a beloved title happen, there would be quite a thorn in the rose. In fact, there would be no less than 11 of them. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, which I will just refer to as After Years from here on out, was released episodically over 11 separate entries. Some of these episodes would be released in bundles, specifically the first 3. The rest would be staggered and sold at a premium. The episodes were developed originally for the mobile phone operating systems of Android, Apple's iOS, and on the Wii via WiiWare, and eventually would have many iterations over several different platforms like the PSP and Steam. The base pack contained the first 3 episodes, which was $8 of Wii points, with every subsequent episode costing $3, bringing the total cost for the complete game to $32. Now, the entire 3D collection can be purchased via Steam for $16, if you are still interested after my review. Now, it should be noted that every episode did not have to be purchased to see the ending of the game, but I will go over why that may or may not have been such a good idea when I get to the gameplay or story portion of this review. So first, I wanted to discuss some things that I feel were done well with this game. Combat is mostly unchanged from Final Fantasy IV, so returning is the ATB system to dictate the flow of combat. There is a new addition to the combat entitled Bands. Bands are similar to the dual techs from Chrono Trigger, where 2 party members combine their turns to unleash unique and usually powerful attacks onto your enemies. An aspect of Bands that I really enjoyed is that the combinations of characters to utilize them were typically also tied together in the story. For instance, Cecil and Rosa have a band entitled Holy Blade, which imbues Cecil's weapon with Rosa's holy magic as he attacks, dealing great damage. Even Biggs and Wedge have a band together, Vibra Edge, which is used in a makeshift tutorial explaining how bands work. Some of the episodes were narratively written quite well. Palums, Porums, Canes, and the Lunarians were among my personal favorites. Returning in its entirety, along with a couple of new additions, is the original Final Fantasy IV soundtrack, so if you loved that one, you're going to love the music in this one as well. Now, with that amazing segue, here's a sample of the track that I have chosen to remix from After Years entitled The Girl from Mista Mima. Okay, so let's begin with the episodic nature of the game and how the story progresses, or rather how it doesn't, with most of the chapters. Now, there will be slight spoilers here, Although I really won't be going too much into the story, specifically more of a broad strokes kind of analysis, but if you don't want to hear anything about the story, skip to this point to avoid it. The initial episode presented at the start of After Years, called Theodore's Tale, this chapter, although slow to get things started, was a decent intro into the game. It is here that we are immediately met with a polarizing part of the game. You get, or have to, depending on your outlook, begin to go back through dungeons and locations from Final Fantasy IV. Now there is one addition of a new dungeon in this episode, the Devil's Road. In the original Final Fantasy IV, the Devil's Road was a short cutscene showing Cecil traveling back to Baron. In After Years, it is a teleporting slog of a messy dungeon, which highlights two very key issues I had with my playthrough on the 3D remake on Steam. First, I cannot tell you how many times that I would have to double or triple check locations for chests because I couldn't see anything, as the camera is so obscenely zoomed in at all times. The second issue is the encounter rate. Mother of God, the encounter rate is over 9,000. It felt like every other step I would trigger another fight. I cannot express these 2 points enough. It made my experience with the game overall a dragging, boring mess. Between having to run through the same dungeons multiple times and fighting every other step on the way, I quickly grew tired of After Years. Considering the flat cost for each chapter, oddly, not every episode is made equal. Some of them are relatively short, while others are much longer in duration. The first episode that really disappointed me from a design standpoint was Rydia's. Narratively, I really enjoyed what they were doing with the Land of the Summons and essentially rebuilding her character. However, I did not enjoy the mechanics nor the design of her episode. Rydia does the majority of the damage dealing in a party of 2, with the other characters serving mostly as a tank, but the game does not provide you of any way of healing yourself outside of potions and a healing rod that you find, which could only be equipped by Rydia. Therefore, requiring the player to either grind money for the necessary healing items or forfeit your ability to kill monsters in a timely manner to keep your health topped off. Yang's, Edge's, and Edward's tales introduced many characters that were ultimately inconsequential. Their stories basically all played out the same, without much of a character development, which was a noticeable strength from Final Fantasy IV. I will say that Palom, Porom, and Kain all got a really good glow up in this game. Not only introducing new characters that you actually care about, but further developing the legacy characters, giving them a character arc that respects the original while moving them forward to a logical conclusion. These 3 stories were definitely the highlight of the entire game for me. Well, that is until we met the figure of all that is man, Swolbez. When we finally get to the Lunarian's Tale, which has Fusoya and Golbez teaming up, you finally get to feel something you haven't had the opportunity to feel throughout every single other tale. Powerful. This was yet another aspect I disliked about the way this game was designed. Sure, it makes sense that you can't have everyone be completely overpowered as you made them when you completed Final Fantasy IV, but every single character has to relearn all of their spells and skills and feels weaker than they should. The game never feels like I am playing characters that previously saved the world, but rather that I am playing the beginning of 10 different games for 2 to 3 hours and quitting before I get any meaningful growth, either narratively or in character strength. Since almost every episode introduces new characters, I think a better design would have been to have the antagonists somehow freeze or eliminate the original's cast's powers. Similarly to how Rydia's chapter is done. Let the player begin the scenario dealing meaningful damage, showing us how strong our heroes are, before breaking them down and focusing on redemption, or perhaps repowering by some means. Narratively speaking, most of the episodes are extremely weak. Not only is there little character or plot growth, what growth there is literally taken from Final Fantasy IV. This happens many times over the different episodes. For instance, you have to go back to the Antlion's lair to cure Harley, who becomes ill when you arrive at Kaipo, or Kain fighting himself on Mount Ordeals to eventually become a Palagoon, or I guess maybe a Dragadin if you prefer. Now, I mentioned earlier that you don't need to buy every chapter to begin the finale, but in the final tale, you do load all of the save files from each chapter. Now, this merges all of the items and all of the XP obtained on each character, so skipping any chapter will significantly impact your party's overall power. One thing that I absolutely loved about the final tale is that it allows you to choose your party from all of the characters that have been introduced. But this brings us to our next design issue. Since this game was released episodically, with weeks between releases, it seemed to be expected that the player would grind experience and levels while waiting for the next batch of episodes to drop. Since I played this game in a single playthrough, I did not grind heavily in any episode. This put me in the detrimental position of being drastically underleveled, making the final episode much more difficult. For Final Fantasy Fridays, which is where we do these playthroughs, both live on my Twitch and on my YouTube channel, I do my best to not do any leveling or playing offline so that we can experience everything together, and that my audience can see my initial reactions to the games. Frustratingly though, with After Years, I had to do an additional 8 hours of offline grinding just to be able to progress through the final dungeons. Speaking of dungeons, I hope you like the Moon, which was the last dungeon from Final Fantasy IV, because in After Years, you're going to go through it multiple times. They did add some new content, but it really feels like padding and not an exciting change. I have not played many RPGs where I was more excited to see the ending over experiencing the entire game. But for After Years, I was already looking forward to finishing the game after completing the first 3 episodes. The game truly felt like a grind to get through, and it made me grind in real life to get through it. With the help of my Discord community to kill time, I had to grind 30 levels with my final party to be able to progress in the final dungeon. Even with such a drastic amount of leveling, the final bosses were still tough, and I did die a couple of times, which was horrible because of the unskippable cutscenes prior to the fight. Overall, an extremely frustrating experience quickly sapped the joy out of playing. I do need to mention a new mechanic that they added for After Years, the Moon phases. The Moon will cycle between 4 separate phases that pass in game time or whether you use a tent. Depending on which phase the Moon is in, you will get a bonus to a specific action, while another one will receive a detriment. This applies to physical attacks, black magic, white magic, and skills. This is another example of After Years that has an interesting idea, but was implemented horribly. Instead of adding an interesting layer of strategy to the game, you find yourself using tents to skip phases until you get the one that benefits your current party's situation. A prime example of this is in Rydia's episode. She uses black magic for damage, so any other moon phase besides the full moon makes her a less effective damage dealer. Since she is the only real damage in your party, this ends up being frustrating, not fun. Also, a certain chapter forces you to be in the full moon phase to obtain a quest item you need to progress. Of course, in my playthrough, it ended just before I got there, requiring the use of 3 tents just so that I could progress the story. With a more open world type game, having a mechanic related to an item pickup could make for a cool narrative. But with a game that is pretty much on rails, it doesn't enhance the experience, but rather it detracts from it. So with all of this being said, does the After Years still hold up? Well, I guess it holds up as much as it did on release. Overall, it is one of the only Final Fantasy experiences that I found myself wanting the playthrough to just be over. It took me 51 hours to get through the After Years, which was just 2 hours shy as it took me to get through Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, and 4 combined, with Final Fantasy 2 and 3 being my first ever playthroughs. Now this could be viewed as a good thing, as far as gameplay versus the cost of all chapters, but the majority of my time played felt more like a chore than anything. Consider this, roughly 10 hours spent on grinding to be able to play the endgame, enemy encounters happening every 2 steps, returning to the same dungeons and locales over and over, in some instances more than 6 times, only getting 15 frames per second in battles, and the overall slog of the writing. The 51 hours didn't fill me with a sense of completion, but rather a sense of relief that it was over. Now I have heard that the 2D version of the game is a better experience, but unfortunately for this review, I can only speak to the one that I had played through. The After Years has very few reviews online, and after completing it, I can see how it could be a decisive review. On the one hand, you have an endearing, familiar cast experiencing a new story, a nostalgic soundtrack, and a huge infusion of new characters. On the other hand, you have a perpetual slog, a poor implementation of mechanics, a disjointed story where you play out the same events multiple times, a camera so far zoomed in that you can see if the character has any blackheads on their nose, and a difficulty curve akin to climbing Mount Everest. I was very disappointed with After Years. I wanted to experience a story that gave these beloved characters a new ending, and sadly it never materialized. Once again, I would like to thank my Patreon patrons. Look at all of these beautiful souls. Without your generosity, I would not be able to continue the series or provide the playthroughs both on my Twitch and YouTube channels. For our next entry in the series, we will be covering one of my favorite entries to the franchise that may shock some of you that may not know me as well. So until then, my fellow warriors of light, praise be to Yevon. Look, even this is so far zoomed in. Why is everything so zoomed in? Oh, thank God.